Welcome to Mr. Hutchings History, where the past comes alive. Let's dive into today's story.
All right, so today we're diving deep into some pretty heavy history, right? We're tackling Hitler and Castro, two dictators, two very different contexts, I guess you could say. But you left us with a big question about these figures.
Yeah.
How much power did they really have? We've got your stack of articles and that podcast episode you sent over, and we're going to try to unpack it all. Like, was it all them, or were there bigger things going on that sort of made it inevitable almost?
Yeah, that's always the question, isn't it? It's tempting to think of these dictators as these like all-powerful figures, but history is usually a lot more complicated than that. If you really dig into how these guys took control and then how they actually held on to that control, it gets pretty interesting and complicated, like I said.
So maybe we should just start right at the beginning then. Hitler in Germany, obviously a democracy that's going through some really, really rough times. And then you've got Castro in Cuba, who literally overthrows the dictator. It feels like two completely different worlds they came from.
And that's what's so fascinating about comparing them. Their methods were so different. Like Hitler, he was a master at exploiting a system that was already cracking under pressure post-World War I Germany. Talk about a powder keg. Economic disaster, political divisions everywhere you look, and Hitler. He saw that chaos and he was like, perfect.
I mean, that podcast episode you shared, the one about the Enabling Act of 1933, it really hit home how quickly things unraveled. Wasn't that the moment Hitler basically, I don't know, hollowed out democracy from the inside out?
Oh, absolutely. That's a chilling example of how fragile these systems can be. The Enabling Act basically handed Hitler the power to make laws without any real oversight from the parliament. Just like that, his word became law.
And then to solidify his grip, there's that night, the night of the long knives. Even just saying the name,
Yeah.
it sends chills down my spine.
And it should. It's a night that should send chills down anyone's spine. Because Hitler had neutralized the threats from outside his party. And now what does he do? He turns inward, eliminates anyone inside the Nazi party who might challenge him. It was, well, a very clear message. He was the Führer, the ultimate authority in Germany.
Total control. Castro's rise, on the other hand, it's almost the opposite, right? I mean, you've got this full-blown revolution, guerrilla warfare. It's like a scene straight out of a movie.
And Castro. He was born to play the part, the charismatic revolutionary hero, fighting for the people, promising freedom and democracy. But, and I know you read about this, things didn't exactly go as promised once he was in power.
Yeah, more like a sharp turn into, more absolute power.
Yeah.
Cuba becomes a socialist state,
Yeah.
a single-party system, and if you even thought about disagreeing with Castro, you were in big trouble. Completely different path than Hitler, but man, did they end up in the same place.
Yeah.
Total control.
Exactly. It just goes to show that dictators, they can come to power in all kinds of ways. Exploiting a weak system, inciting a revolution. The method might be different, but that end goal is the same, and it's scary.
Okay, so they both get to the top of the mountain, but then there's the whole staying there thing, holding on to power, and that's where propaganda comes in, right?
100%. Both Hitler and Castro, they were masters of shaping the story that their people believed. They knew that controlling information was just as important as controlling armies. Maybe even more so.
And with Hitler, it just feels so blatant, like it's everywhere.
Mm-hmm.
Just that name, Goebbels, Hitler's propaganda chief, you hear that name, you know what's coming. It was constant, this message of Aryan supremacy, Hitler as Germany's savior. You couldn't escape it.
Right, and it wasn't just billboards and radio addresses. Remember that article you sent over about the Hitler Youth? They were indoctrinating children. I mean, can you imagine the long-term impact of something like that? A whole generation taught to be loyal from childhood.
It's terrifying, honestly. And it actually makes me think about some of the stuff you flagged in Castro's Cuba. Like, even things that seem, I don't know, totally positive, even those things can be twisted. You mentioned his literacy campaign.
Oh, yeah, that's a perfect example. On the surface, it sounds great, right? Eradicating illiteracy, who could be against that? But underneath it all, it was a really smart way to spread the message of the revolution. You control what people can read, you control how they think.
And then there were those Castro speeches, right?
Yeah.
Everyone's heard about them, how he could hold a whole nation captive just with his words. I mean, it really makes you think about the power of a single voice, especially when it's the only voice anyone's allowed to hear.
Exactly. And that's something that we still deal with today. Maybe not state-run media exactly, but who controls the information we see? Whose voices get heard? Whose get drowned out? It makes you really stop and think about what's influencing the way we see the world.
It really makes you think. And it makes you wonder, like, even with these guys, these dictators, blasting out their message, were they really the ones calling on the shots? Or was there more to it?
See, that's where your question gets really interesting, especially when you look at the case of Hitler. Historians, they still go back and forth about this. Like, how deep did his control really go? Was it all part of some master plan? Or was he more about setting the agenda, this terrifying agenda, and then letting everyone else scramble to, make him happy?
Well, you have historians like Dawidowicz and
Mhm.
Jekyll, right? They say Hitler was the mastermind behind it all, that he was calling the shots, that even the Holocaust, it was all part of his plan from the very beginning.
Exactly. That's what they call the intentionalist view. They look at Hitler as this micromanager, this control freak, and every decision, especially when it came to things like foreign policy and the Holocaust, it all came back to him. I think it was one of your articles, Davidovich called him the, what was it? The prime mover of the Holocaust.
Yeah.
The one who set that whole horrific machine in motion.
But then you've got people like Mommsen and Brozat, and they're saying, hold on a second, not so fast. There are the structuralists, and they have a completely different take on how the Nazi state worked. They're saying it was actually super chaotic, with all these different factions fighting for power, trying to interpret these vague orders that Hitler would throw around.
Yeah, and that's what's so interesting about their argument. They're saying that Hitler was actually, and this is going to sound weird, but he was almost detached from the day-to-day stuff. Instead of giving out specific orders, he'd lay out these big, scary goals, and then it was up to his inner circle to figure out how to actually achieve them, which, of course, often meant brutal competition between them.
Which is kind of a terrifying thought in itself, right? The idea that so much evil could come from people just trying to please the guy at the top.
It's chilling. And this whole idea of working towards the Fuhrer like it was some noble cause, it's really unsettling because it suggests that people felt like they could commit atrocities, even without a direct order, as long as they thought it was what Hitler wanted. Just imagine that for a second. Imagine the pressure, the fear that creates in a society. You please the dictator, even if it means doing terrible things, and you get ahead.
It makes you really think about, like, where's the line between following orders and being responsible for your own actions?
Exactly, and it's something people are still debating. Where does that line disappear? When you're living under a dictatorship, how much choice do you really have?
So how does Castro fit into all of this? Do you think he was more hands-on than Hitler? More involved in the, I don't know, the nuts and bolts of how things were run?
Oh, for sure. With Castro, there's not as much debate. He was definitely deeply involved in the Cuban government. I mean, his control was absolute, and he didn't have to deal with the same level of internal power struggles that Hitler did. Once Castro took over, that was it. He was in charge.
But even with that, he still put a lot of effort into crafting this very specific image, right? The whole revolutionary hero thing, the man of the people fighting for their freedom.
Of course, and that image, it wasn't an accident. That was calculated. It was all about legitimizing his rule. Think about it. He becomes this authoritarian leader, but at the same time, people see him as a champion for social justice, a symbol of Cuban independence, standing up to the U.S. He played into those existing resentments, and positioned himself as the only one who could truly lead Cuba.
Which brings us right back to controlling the narrative, right? Even when a message seems positive, like we're talking about fighting illiteracy, promoting social justice, striving for independence, even then, it can be a tool for control.
You got it. And that's why it's so important to be skeptical of everything, really, even if it sounds good on the surface. Who's telling the story? Whose voices are we hearing? And more importantly, whose voices are we not hearing? Who benefits when we accept a certain narrative as the truth? These are questions we should be asking ourselves all the time about everything, not just history.
It's easy to just accept a narrative, especially when it's wrapped up in something positive. But history has shown us, time and time again, that it's crucial to look deeper, to question everything.
100%. And that's what makes these deep dives so important, It's not just about looking back. It's about using the past to understand the present and to hopefully, make better decisions in the future.
So we've got these two dictators, two different paths to power, different styles, different beliefs, but it seems like the end result was the same. They were both able to gain absolute control.
Yeah. It's a scary thought, right? It reminds you that power, no matter who has it, no matter how good their intentions might seem, it's a dangerous thing. When one person or one party has all the power, things can go bad really, really quickly.
Which is why it's so important to have checks and balances, right? A free press, freedom of speech. These aren't just like abstract ideas they teach in school. These are the things that protect us from tyranny, from repeating the mistakes of the past.
You said it. Hitler, Castro, they're just two examples of what happens when those protections disappear. And it's a reminder that we can never take those freedoms for granted.
So as we start to wrap up this deep dive, what are your final thoughts for our listeners? We've gone through a lot. The rise of these dictators, the dangers of propaganda, how fragile truth can be. Where do we go from here?
You know, if there's one thing I hope people take away from this, it's the importance of staying vigilant. We can't just accept things at face value. We have to be critical thinkers. We have to question everything. Because the road to tyranny, it can start with good intentions, you know? It can start with promises of a better future. But if we're not careful, it can end up in the same terrible place.
It's a lot to take in, for sure. So for you, having gone through all of the materials and everything, what really stuck with you? What were your biggest takeaways from all of this?
You know, it's funny. As I was going back through everything you sent, one thing kept coming back to me, and it's this. Both these guys, Hitler, Castro, they were so good at using stories. You know what I mean? Like Hitler, he tapped into this whole yearning for this glorious past, right? This idea of Germany being strong again. And then you've got Castro, and he's all about righteous rebellion, fighting back against oppression. And they use those stories, those narratives, to justify everything, to get people on their side, to solidify their power. And it makes you wonder, what stories are we being told today, even if they sound good, even if they sound positive? Who's telling those stories? Whose voices are we hearing? And more importantly, whose voices are we not hearing?
That's such an important point. It's easy to get caught up in a good story. To just accept it without thinking about, why is the story being told? And who might it benefit?
Exactly. We can't just be passive consumers of information. We have to be active participants, you know? We have to ask those tough questions, look for different perspectives, because the more informed we are, the better equipped we are to, I don't know, to navigate this crazy world, right? And make sure we're not just following someone else's script.
It's a call to action, really, for all of us. We have to be engaged, we have to be informed, and we have to be, like you said, critical. And on that note, I think we've reached the end of our deep dive. It's been a journey, for sure. From the rise of dictators to this whole idea of propaganda, how easy it is to manipulate the truth. But, like you said earlier, this is just the beginning.
The journey continues, right? You guys have done so much work gathering these sources, diving into this heavy stuff. But now it's about taking what you've learned and using it. Keep asking those questions, keep challenging the narratives, and most importantly, never stop learning.
Couldn't have said it better myself. This has been a real deep dive, and I feel like we've only scratched the surface. But that's the beauty of it, right? There's always more to learn. So, until next time, keep exploring, keep those minds working, and as always, stay curious.
Thanks for listening to Mr. Hutchings History. Keep exploring, and we'll see you next time.